How are we this evening? Oh, let's do that again. How are we this evening? There we go. I love it. I love it. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. My name is Sarah Cawley. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Great Falls Public Library. And we are in the middle of Feisty Women's Week. Yay! We are so excited to have cross-collaborated with Visit Great Falls in order to put this on, and we're just stoked that it kind of worked out perfectly with everything else. So thank you again for coming. We are thrilled to have you here, and we are so excited to also be partnering with Humanities Montana in order to have tonight's program. Our presenter today is Mary Jane Bradbury, a storyteller, a historic interpreter who draws on over 25 years as an actress, educator, and author to bring history to life. She holds a master's degree in speech communication from Regis University. She is a Chautauqua speaker for Humanities Montana and the Colorado Humanities, and has been an artist in residence for the Charlie M. Russell Museum in Great Falls, right here, woo-woo, and the Montana Historical Society. Before leaving Colorado and moving to Montana in 2014, Mary Jane was an interpreter / an actor for the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Tonight's program is And Yet They Persisted, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and equality in America. If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Embodies the uncompromising, independent leadership necessary for what the suffragist movement fought for, a voice and a vote. The road to achieving votes for women was challenging, filled with biases and complexities. It's an important history to understand, not only for the tactics women used to prevail against the status quo of their day, but for the belief that women had an important role to play in their future. The iconic reformers and activists of the past have given us a legacy to build upon as we keep the conversation alive and continue to strive for equality in America. Today, we will hear about these women, their times, their trials and triumphs, and most especially, their willingness to persist until the work was done. Please join me in welcoming Mary Jane to the stage.
Yes, indeed. Can everyone hear me? Yes, good. Indeed, feisty women, you're not going to find a bigger batch of them. Charlie Russell once said, a bigger bunch of hellraisers I never saw bunched when he went to a suffrage meeting in New York, way back. So in 2019, when the 2020 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment was looming, I said, well, I'm going to create a program about that. It was a lot of fun, a lot of history, good stuff. And I only did it twice in 2020 before everything closed down. And then, people were playing with Zoom. It wasn't something everyone knew how to use yet, so it was kind of inconsistent and unreliable. I did a couple of Zooms, didn't go over as great as it could if you've got people who are going to converse about things. So it just kind of went into a dormant stage, and then of course we all know that those years that we spent struggling to get our feet back under us in all sorts of different ways didn't lend itself to doing too many programs. So when Sarah asked me to bring this up again, I thought, so much has happened in the world of equality and women's stuff and all this. Well, I'm going to just have to go in and tweak that content. And then I learned one of the lessons that I teach all the time, which is history doesn't change. That story up to when I wrote it doesn't change. What we think about it, how we look at it, how we perceive it, that changes and has greatly in the last 4 years, but not the history itself. So I didn't have any tweaking to do. I just got it back up and going so that we could have the conversation tonight. So let's get started with a couple of definitions. We hear about suffrage, the suffrage movements. To suffer means to allow. So in this case, to allow political freedom. That's what the suffrage movement was asking for. The franchise is the synonym for the vote. A franchise is a right or a privilege. You hear about enfranchisement in bringing people into a group that they belong to. And then you hear the word disenfranchised, was people who are left out of the groups. So you'll hear that word franchise, and then equality. Equality in the case of this story means the opportunity to equally participate in our political process. Just wanted a voice so that they could equally participate in creating the laws that govern them. When I use the word women, we need to think about the word women. It's the broad stroke. And in this particular story, up until 1920, I'm talking about middle and upper class white women. Working class women, women of color, Native American women, they were not considered part of the process at the time. And so when the women's vote was achieved in 1920, it didn't quite include everyone. It needed some more history to pass before it could conclude everyone. Another reminder is that print is the only mass media in any of the story. Telephones were beginning to be more common by the turn of the 20th century, so early 1900s, but they weren't a conduit for mass media. Print, magazines, newspapers, flyers, political cartoons, and depending on where you lived and what access you had to what kind of print media would greatly influence how you thought about this whole idea that women should be out and about. Okay, I think that's my only reminder. So our Constitution does not specifically say that women can't vote. But women's rights at the time the Constitution was written in the late 1700s were vague, they were vulnerable, and that idea that women would participate in any sort of political process was left up to states, and states all excluded women. The gender designation about who can do what in this country was just assumed that it would be white men, and in the early days, voting went to white property men who owned land. So when this women's reform movement started, officially in 1848, it was a revolution. We take so for granted today all the things that women can do in the first this and the first that, and there are no more firsts really anymore. Women can do just about everything. But at the time that this revolution started, these were women who were going not only against what was legal, what was politically okay, but what was culturally okay. For generations, hundreds of years, a woman's role was defined as a very thin line, not in the public, at home, raising children, being married, no external activity at all. And so when you come up against this idea that women are going to be out there, well, you're upsetting the status quo. And that's a huge hurdle to get over. It wasn't just about making new laws, it was about changing everyone's minds. I always like the idea that we're 6 inches away from everything going the way we want it to, and it's the 6 inches between people's ears. We've got to change minds, and that doesn't happen easily, especially when there's so much pushback, I will say. All right, so let's get started with the story then. Women's Rights Convention, Seneca Falls, 1848, was the first official gathering, but this idea had been around for a long time. Abigail Adams famously requested of her husband when he was helping to write the Constitution, please remember the ladies. Women will not be so inclined to consider themselves bound by laws in which they have neither voice nor representation. Not that long ago, I read what he wrote back to her, and I didn't write it down, I should have, but it amounted to don't be silly. Mary Wollstonecraft, the first feminist writing that was put into print in a vindication on the rights of women, said, okay, fine, women belong in the home, they raise the children, they're good wives. But they'd be so much better at that if they had an education. And when her book first came out, it was published under a pseudonym, so they didn't know it was a woman, and was thought to be, wow, this is kind of good information. This idea might just catch on. But when the second edition was published under her exact name, it was pushed aside and said, no, that we're not ready for that yet. Angelina Grimke. The Grimke sisters were born on a plantation in North Carolina. They were a slave-owning family, and they were staunch abolitionists by the time they came of age. And Angelina, in 1838, addressed the Massachusetts legislature, trying to see if they couldn't convince Washington, D.C., to abolish slavery, and if the nation's capital abolished slavery, then the rest of the states would as well. Now, she did not succeed at that, but she did two things. First of all, she was the first woman to address a legislative body of any sort, and the first woman to really put herself in a place where she was speaking in public. This was not okay. A woman speaking in public is putting herself on display for people to look at, and now this was just immoral. So she really was pushing the envelope. She said, we abolitionist women are turning the world upside down, she said, and I'm sorely tempted to believe I have had a triumph. Lucy Stone was an early abolitionist as well, the first woman to get a college degree in Massachusetts. And she too spoke out for the Anti-Slavery Society. I shall brave ridicule and persecution for the sake of the good that will result. In 1840, the first World's Convention for Anti-Slavery was held in London, and the United States sent a delegation of men and women to that. Lucretia Mott was in that delegation. She was a well-respected speaker at that point. And when they got to London, they would not seat the women delegates. So the women had to go up in the balcony and be behind a curtain. They only let the men be seated. But when she was up there, in that balcony, she met a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And the two of them were incensed by this treatment, and they said, when we get back to the United States, we're going to do something about this. And it took a while for them to get around to it. 8 years later in Seneca Falls, they met and decided to have this Women's Rights Convention. Now, they drafted a declaration of sentiments that had some line items in it. First of all, the right to an education, the right to participate in the public sphere, leave home and participate in the public sphere, access to professions, equal pay, and the right to keep it, and the vote. And when the 300 women crowded into that little Methodist chapel in that hot July day in 1848, they all thought all these resolutions were great except for the right to vote, because that was really asking for too much. But by the time the convention was over, 100 women had signed that petition, and then things were off and running. Different states had regional women's rights conventions, and then the first national convention was held in 1851, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton met a woman named Susan B. Anthony. Now, they were the perfect melding of talent and skill and passion. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had young children. She couldn't really travel, but she was a brilliant writer. Susan B. Anthony was a single woman. She was a Quaker abolitionist. She'd been a teacher. She was a compelling speaker. And together they formed one of the most formidable partnerships in the history of reform in this country. Now, well-behaved women rarely make history. Heard that? Yeah. Does that mean that poorly behaved women do make history? You know, Mae West once said that it pays to be good, but it doesn't pay a lot. What did it mean to be a well-behaved woman? Well, Godey's Lady's Book, one of those periodicals that came out of the beginnings of the reform movement in March of 1852 defined a well-behaved woman as this: courteous, cheerful, polite, pious, industrious and good-natured, moral and benevolent, avoids gossip, fault-finding, grumbling, and public displays of family quarrels. She is not stubborn or self-centered. She has good table manners and shows respect for parents. And with this, she should be able to obtain her culturally determined goal of a good marriage and motherhood. Now, furthermore, women had no place in public life because of inferior physical capabilities, confirmed by the lack of a robust constitution. But how robust would anybody be when they were trussed up in all those clothes and hung with 15, 20 pounds of material? No opportunity to really improve their poor physical capabilities because they weren't allowed to exercise. If women indulge in exceptional exertion, they are inclined to nervous exhaustion and neurasthenic disease. Delicate, high-strung, subject to nervous irritability and neurasthenic disease, women need to avoid anxiety-producing, enervating situations, intense mental excitement, anger, grief, joy. All of this brings further injury to the health. Women are too frail to be citizens, and their efforts, acted out rashly and foolishly, make them ultimately unfit for public life because of perilous injury brought on by the irritations of the outside world. So, not only were women bound by political and social restrictions, they were bound by what they wore. Dress reform had to accompany social reform. The Chicago Tribune had an editorial around that time about this, and they said no sane person can possibly dispute the fact that women have just as much right to leg freedom as men. For some inscrutable reason, this liberty has been denied them. So people were writing articles about this. And let's look at some of the restrictions that were going on. So I'm including this little rabbit hole in this whole thing because I want you to understand, again, what women were up against. 1860s, hourglass corset, very tight waist, and that huge 91 inches was the normal circumference of that hoop skirt. And it's, as you can see, women really had no activities going on below the waist. They didn't have bodily functions below the waist. They didn't have legs below the waist. That skirt allowed them to float through the world, and they had limbs if you had to talk about their legs, but honestly, there wasn't anything going on there. And they could be pure and sanctified, and we could all think of them as these amazing angels holding the light of the home for all of us. 1870s, that hoop goes away, but big bustles are going to start to come in. But they still haven't gotten rid of very much of the fabric. The 1870s had a lot of trains and ruchings of fabric around the waist. The 1880s, a lot of the extra stuff goes away, but that bustle becomes very pronounced. And one gentleman wrote you could put a teacup on a saucer on the back of a woman's bustle, and it could stay there all afternoon. In the 1890s, a lot of the extraneous fabric's gone away, but that corset now that is shaping a woman's body has turned from the hourglass to this S curve. You know, still very much proper, very much bound. And thank you, gentlemen, for indulging while we look at this a little further. Here is that early corset. That is the hourglass. And then we go to the S curve. And it's called mono bosom. You know, you just have this thing going on. You see in front, back, but I want to take a moment, and please don't be offended. what is going on inside this woman's body? Oh. There needs to be room for your innards. And with the corset, and in many cases, women sometimes remove their lower ribs so that they could get that corset tight, because the size of a woman's waist reflected tremendously on the wealth of her family, the position of her husband or her father in society. So, you're trying to have a conversation about the rights that you want, and here you are, all bound up and physically not well. Of course you don't have a robust constitution. How could you? 1890s, 1870s in the middle, and then 1910s. Those women look a whole lot more comfortable. You can get out and carry a sign and walk down the street and say, I want to vote. Better in that conversation there than you can otherwise. So women were battling on so many fronts. And when we talk about the first woman lawyer, the first doctor, things we take for granted today, when we look at this context, it took courage to stand up not only to the intellectual and political conversations, but also to just see yourself differently. I love this. And it just dawned on me this morning when I was going through these. That's a male lion, but so what? I just love this. This is it. I would imagine, and maybe I'm the only one, but I look in the mirror sometimes and I have to come up with this kind of a strategy for myself on any given day or whatever I'm facing. So the courage that it took to be confronting all of these layers of what was against their achieving something so, I don't know, it just seems so normal to imagine that they would be allowed to participate in their society. Okay, so, dressed however they were dressed, women were working alongside the abolitionists up to 1861. And when the Civil War broke out, they put the suffrage ideas aside and worked strongly for the abolition of slavery. They volunteered to be nurses in the war. They took care of the sick. They wrapped bandages, did whatever they needed to do, thinking that if we can get the slaves free, it will follow naturally that women will be included in that group and we'll have, this whole thing will come to a head. But that's not what happened, and here's something that is still with us today with what they would call the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment, ratified at the end of the year the Civil War ended, abolished slavery, but didn't do much else. We have almost 2 million people now that are free, but are they citizens? Are they protected by the laws of this country? Are they subject to the laws of this country? There wasn't anything defining that. It just said no more slavery. So there needed to be another amendment, the 14th Amendment. And here's the first time in our Constitution where sex, gender, if you will, never too sure how to use those two words today, but the designation of male and female is used. Citizen was a man. Oh, now wait a minute. If a citizen is a man and the slaves are free and there's black men, does that mean black men get to vote? So there needed to be another amendment. So the American Equal Rights Association was formed. The women said, this is it. When they make that 15th Amendment, we're going to make sure it includes women. They lobbied for it. They campaigned for it. But when the 15th Amendment was ratified, the right of citizens in the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It said nothing about women, black or white. So now we have a problem. This was grounds for splitting the women's suffrage movement. For years, women and blacks had worked together to get equality for all of them. Now black men are recognized as citizens, leaving women, black and white, out. Stanton and Anthony were incensed, and they introduced a new perspective. The uneducated, immigrant, slave of yesterday are lawmakers of today. Think of these lower orders of men who cannot read the Declaration of Independence, making laws for the daughters of Adams and Jefferson. Shall American statesmen so amend their constitution to make their wives and mothers the political inferiors of unlettered and unwashed ditch diggers, fresh from the plantations of the South? Racism is now employed as a point to point out the unfairness of who could vote. Men of all sorts, apologize for the language, ignorant immigrants, uneducated black men, convicts, imbeciles could vote, but not educated white women. The American Equal Rights Association, which was Lucy Stone, she said, hey, it's something. At least we got something done. We can still work for women's vote state by state. But Anthony and Stanton said no, they broke off and went and formed another branch, the National Suffrage Association and then the American Suffrage Association, two groups. And they went about going for this vote separately. Of course, black women were not included in either, and they had a lot on their plate. They were trying to create community. They were trying to keep their families together, trying to see what was going to happen with this new way that things were supposed to be without a lot of leadership or direction. So these amendments were so critical. How were former slaves going to be incorporated into society? How was the U.S. going to operate as a multiracial democracy? Citizens were now defined as men. This was the first time the gender distinction was in the Constitution, and it excluded women. Another powerful group, if we need some more complexity, was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Let's not have alcohol. Well, they were for the vote, because if women had a voice, they could influence the laws that could protect them. They had no protections against the homes that were being driven apart by alcoholism, and they had no way to ask for money. They couldn't take care of their children. Children were the property of men. I mean, they were for the vote for that perspective, but they also just wanted to get prohibition passed. So by the turn of the 20th, not much happened. You got two suffrage groups kind of going in their own directions, got the same goal in mind, but they're fighting on terms of ideology. So you get up to the 1890s, and things are beginning to change. A lot of the things that weren't available to women when the whole movement started, owning property, access to education, being able to have wages and keep them, alimony, things that would protect their rights, were beginning to take place on state levels. So there was a lot of progress being made. And in the 1890s, 4 states in the West, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho, did give women the right to vote. By 1896, these 4 states, well, things are changing now. Things are turning around. It's going to be great sailing. Not quite yet. Stanton and Anthony were getting old. So they turned over what was now the reformed, complete National American Women's Suffrage Association. The two groups combined themselves again under the direction of Carrie Chapman Catt and Dr. Anna Shaw. And they were great organizers, great promoters. The nickname for Carrie Catt was the General. You could see how maybe she had some energy of being a general going on there. This was also a time at the turn of the 20th century where a lot of voices wanted to be heard. Think labor unions. Think black rights, civil rights for black people. Jim Crow laws had just dismantled Reconstruction in the South if it ever got a foothold. And so there was a lot of voices being raised. Not surprisingly, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was not integrated, so black women leaders came to the forefront. Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells were strong leaders. Ida B. Wells was present when they formed the NAACP. And black women started forming clubs. The turn of the 20th century was the era of club women. You know, we're out in the world now. We got a little education. We got some things going on here. Let's have a literature club. Let's have a science club. Let's have a club that supports the schools. All these women were now beginning to take public roles with or without the vote. There was a word for this person, a new woman. Now, in some states in the West, she could vote, but again, she could own property, she could keep her wages. Also, it was beginning to be said that exercise is good for a woman. Exercise gives women an energy and an endurance and a dexterity and a presence of mind that cannot be overestimated as a sedative for nervous irritability and relief from hypochondria brought on by a sedentary life. And don't you know, there was an invention that had evolved to the point where women could use it and it was a bicycle. Oh my goodness. Not only can they get exercise, but it was called the instrument of the devil by detractors because this allowed women to go places by themselves. Didn't need somebody to take you in the carriage or pretty soon the automobile. You could get on a bicycle and ride somewhere by yourself. That freedom was so... And as you can imagine, if there's all this progress being made, the detractors are going to get louder and louder and louder. So let's look at some of the political propaganda. Give women the vote and let mothers protect their children. The hand that rocks the cradle, is it the same as the hand that pours the alcohol? And this woman, with no vote, there's no remedy for long hours and short pay. There were women working in factories and in offices, and they wanted to have a voice so that they could change things for themselves. And of course, the emasculating idea that once I get my liberty, no more wedding bells for me, and then this poor man has to do whatever it is he's doing in the home. I've been doing for generations. You may do the voting, but I am the boss. And this is my favorite. Votes for women, yes, you bet. That good time will reach us yet. When men folks know how housework feels, we'll have Campbell's soup at all our And of course, Theodore Roosevelt's president, and he said, let the people rule. And so here's a bunch of disreputable looking men. We're the people, we're the animals, and the women are asking, we're what? And here's a founding father querying himself, did I save my country for this? And New York State, the most progressive state in the whole Union, over and over and over defeated suffrage. So, hugging the delusion, never going to happen. Might as well give up. So something needed to happen because nothing was happening after those 4 states gave women the right to vote. You get into the early 1900s, nothing's happening. So we need something new. Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul, they had both worked in suffrage activities in England. And the English suffragists were a whole lot more militant than the American suffragists ever were. They wanted to go about campaigning with parades and have a booth at the fair and go door to door, get out there. Don't just go to the local congressman and say, please give us the vote, which is what the traditional suffragists were still doing. So now you've got not a split group, but a group with some different ideas about how to go about this. Alice Paul went one step further. The day before President Wilson's inauguration in 1913, she organized a suffrage parade in Washington. 8,000 women, groups, homemakers groups, office working groups, nurses, quilters, whatever group you wanted, you could have that. We had bands, we had all of these people, and she said to the police in Washington, D.C., we probably should have some protection. They just ignored her. 500,000 people came to that. Now, I just cringe when I look at this picture because look at that vulnerable little line of well-behaved women walking down the... But if the lines of those spectators were to break, they'd be overwhelmed, and that's exactly what happened. When they got close to the White House, the lines did break. The women were what they'd always experienced. They were beaten, they were trampled, and a lot of people were hurt. No one was arrested that day, but the police commissioner eventually lost his job. World War I breaks out. Well, women didn't put their suffrage ideas aside. They kept working for it, but they also said, look, all we're doing, here we are, we can't be citizens for all we're doing. They went to Europe. America wouldn't let women doctors serve in the army, so a bunch of women doctors went to France and were taken, yes, please, and honored. They don't make the history books in this country, though. And yet they persisted. And of course, right in 1916, one of those states in the West that had given women the right to vote, she ran. There were 4 people in that election, the incumbent Democrat, another Democrat, she is a Republican, and another Republican, and she was 7,600 votes ahead of the person who came in third. She was, Montana had just been given a second seat in Congress. So the incumbent went back in, but she was voted into that second seat. And I love this, I have to get up here and read it because I can't see it, but why should we elect her? Because she's proven that she's qualified. She can work directly for the passage of national suffrage, because Montana should be the first state in the United States to have a woman in Congress, because the women of Montana have the right to be and should be represented in Congress, because she will have the opportunity to work directly for national prohibition. All right, now. By 1917, like everything was going into chaos. Of course, we had voted to go to war in the spring of 17, but women were picketing the White House, and they were they were asking, when President Wilson called for a declaration of war with Germany, he pointed out that the poor Germans are not self-governed. And their point was 20 million American women are not self-governed. When are you going to start caring about them? Now, these women, you can see how awfully disruptive they are. They were arrested for disturbing traffic, put into prison, hard labor, force-fed if they wouldn't eat, beaten at midnight raids. It was very bad. Alice Paul herself was arrested 20 times. In prison, she was isolated and given psychiatric evaluation to prove her mental instability. And here are the grounds for her being mentally unstable. I have to read these exact words. Her failure to marry and have a family, a zealous pursuit of education, public displays of strong opinions, and an unnatural desire for privacy and independence. The treatment for this was leg shackles, shock treatment, surgery if it would come to it, all to keep her under control and hopefully help her govern herself. These feisty women needed to govern themselves, but it wasn't going to happen. They just persisted. Word got out that this was the treatment of these women, and President Wilson couldn't look away anymore. He had been against it, no matter how much Mrs. Catt and her army of women was striding the halls of Congress trying to convince them to do this. This is what got them over the hump. He let the women out of prison. He said they're never going to give up. They're going to keep going. And in January 1918, the question of women's suffrage came to the halls of Congress. It passed in the House in 1918 January, but it didn't pass in the Senate until 1920 January. 2 years. Now we have to have it ratified, and it would take 9 months to ratify it. And then in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution in the exact same words that Susan B. Anthony proposed 45 years earlier. Shall not be denied, the right to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. So, it was far from over. The 19th Amendment was in place, but again, it did not include all women. 1924, before the Native American Citizenship Act was put in, and so then you could technically vote. But as we all know, with what goes on in the South at the time, you could keep people from voting by all sorts of means, and that's a lot of what was applied to Native Americans. Asian women weren't considered eligible for this until 1948. It's a long time. Alice Paul proposed in 1923 the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment, a federal amendment, because without it, women wouldn't have any grounds to defend themselves in federal cases. She proposed it in 1923. Versions of it came and went, and in 1972 it was finally passed by both houses of Congress. And given 4 years to be ratified, well, it didn't make that deadline. And then another 4 years were added, I think 1982 or something. Didn't make it by then. And it's a little fuzzy to me what happened, but it just kind of went away. 2020. The last state needed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, Virginia, finally passed. But it had been so long since the deadline. As I understand it, nobody quite knows what to do with it. It hasn't been admitted to the Constitution. People would say, well, why bother now? Because women have all this other stuff. They've gotten it in other means. State constitutions protect them. But to have an official amendment to our Constitution, our federal Constitution, is an important step in finalizing the fact that that women are recognized as citizens. So when I think about this story, a couple things come up. Equality is not pie. When you give away pieces of pie, pretty soon the pie is gone. So if I give you pieces of pie, I'm going to have less. But that's not how equality works. I can give you all the equality you want, and I can still have mine. And that is one of the ideas, I think, that people were afraid. I think fear is the one thing that holds people back. Afraid to give equality to people other than themselves, because somehow maybe it will diminish what they have. Simply isn't true. And I can't help but wondering, those early suffragists, after a few decades, 1850s, 1860s, and all that went on then, 70s, they had to imagine that they weren't going to live to see it happen. But they kept persisting. They persisted, and they stayed with it because they were working for something that was going to be gloriously grand for people that came after them. Sometimes I wonder, when I look at the world today, we're so concerned about what's going on right now, and we're going to get this done right away, and I have to achieve my goal. What are we working for that might take longer than our own lifetimes going forward? If the history of the women's suffrage movement gives us any sort of a lesson, it's persistence, it's perseverance. Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself said that the most important asset a woman has is her courage. And I would say that's true for all of us, men and women. Our courage is what propels us to do what's right, to live authentically, to be present for what we can do to make the world a better place, so that 100 years from now, people will look back on us and be glad that we persisted. Right. That's all I have about this story, but I would love to hear from you if you have any questions. This is a huge history, so I will answer them to the best of my knowledge. So please be free to ask a question or start a conversation.
Anyone?
I know this is always the awkward moment.
I'll take the first question. How's that?
Yes, Sam, do it.
So I've often wondered, there was pushback from men. Was there pushback from women in that era too?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Was there pushback from women? Probably the strongest pushback from women. So, okay, so you've got your, again, white women, mostly privileged. Why should we? Labor reformer Mary Harris Jones, remember Mother Jones, the labor reformer, once said, women's jobs are far beyond the right to vote. Why should women want to get involved in the vicious hell of politics? You can raise hell without having the vote. And she did. But that was sort of the overarching idea. You know, do you want to go down to the precinct where they're all drinking beer and smoking cigars? That's just not where a woman belongs. And be laughed at and made fun of. You have your home, and you can go to your women's club. You know, let's not upset the apple cart. And these were, again, women who didn't really roll their sleeves up quite like the ones who were out there campaigning and being put into prison and such. So yes, the anti-suffrage movement was strongly supported by a lot of women. In our lifetime, I see a lot of people who could possibly remember the 1970s. What about Phyllis Schlafly? After both houses of Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, it was a shoo-in to be ratified within just a year. But what did she do? She campaigned. She said, oh, women, you don't want this. Why should you want this? We have such a great opportunity to just not, to be above all. We don't need this. You should see, what is the name of that movie? Kate Blanchett plays Schlafly. And the irony to me is she was telling women they didn't want to be in the world in this way, and she was the prime example of doing it. She was out in the world, she was campaigning, she was causing a lot of waves, but she told women they shouldn't want to do it. So, you know, again, let me put up the kitten and the lion picture. What do you see when you look in the mirror? So in our own lifetime, the anti-suffrage movement can be strong. And I would point to, what are people afraid of? Equality is not pie. There's enough to go around. Yes?
I find it interesting that the states that first had suffrage for women are not the ones that most of us would have expected, given where they are today. But I also have read that it wasn't necessarily a sort of grand commitment to equality, but women in those places, they were digging in the fields. They were doing all the work, and those states also thought, you know, if we let women vote, then we have extra people representing us. So, you know, it was...
Absolutely. Wyoming did that in their first state constitution, territorial constitution actually. They They gave women the right to vote for exactly that reason. A citizen can vote. So if you've got 50 men who can vote, or 50 men and 50 women, you've got twice as many citizens. And that's what they did with that. But yes, in the West, men were much more open-minded. These women are out there working side by side with us, and plus, the woman comes west with her wagon train and her husband, gets hurt or killed or something, she's got to step up, and they did step up. Imagine these frail women stepping up and taking these positions, and the men said, yeah, right. 1893, so Wyoming often loves to say it was the first state to give women the right to vote. It was grandfathered in their territorial constitution when they became a state. But Colorado was the first state where the woman had to campaign. And to me, they had to walk right up to those men and say, you need to let me vote, and here's why. It took a lot more courage than staying at home and letting it be grandfathered in. I'm not denigrating Wyoming women. But when Wyoming says it was the first state, I like to make the distinction. Because those Colorado women were some of the first. They were strong club women. They were out there. Idaho and Utah were next. And you're right. We can double our population if we let the women vote.
What was the timeline for, because you said that it was just white women who could vote at first. What was the timeline like when non-white women could begin to vote? And when the suffrage was first passed, do you think that minority women felt more emboldened that maybe we'll be able to vote soon too? I guess, what was that? Or did they, the people who opposed minority women from voting, did they oppose it more because suffrage passed? I guess, what was it, what did that look like?
So, in a lot of these cases, and it's still probably true today, it's either by law or by custom, things are done. So by law, it might be one thing, but by custom, and this was true for like women speaking in public, it was custom that they didn't. So when the amendment passed saying you can't discriminate against voting on account of sex, it was the custom to imagine that this was a white woman's law. In the South, Jim Crow laws were keeping black men from voting, so women weren't going to have a chance there. Native American women weren't considered citizens until 1924, but of course, and we still struggle with a lot of some of these rules and regulations that make it difficult for people to vote and have a voice. What is that? Was that most?
Yeah, just I guess when suffrage passed, minority women, do you think they were just like, well, that's great, but we still can't vote? Or did they see it as like, well, would that happen, there's a chance that we could also vote?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a minority woman. I imagine that the racism that was applied in so many instances, not just over the vote, was definitely institutionalized in this country, North and South. But I'm imagining that it did give them, it would say, well, they could do it. At some point, things will change. And look at the civil rights movement in this country in the 1960s. So that's a great question. And I think it's difficult to put yourself in other people's shoes in some cases. And, it's easy to be flippant and just go, oh, well, women can do this, but we have no idea the levels that other people have had to struggle with if you're white in this country. There's a couple things, we're coming to our end. I love that you came out tonight. I want to point out a couple things that have changed since 2020. A documentary came out entitled 13. It's about the 13th Amendment. Find it and watch it, because it abolished slavery, but the clause in there said, unless you're incarcerated. Then you can round up all the people who are in jail and make them go out and work. And that's what Obama said during his presidency, that the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's inmates. And that's why. Because black men could be standing in the street just doing nothing wrong, but be thrown into prison for an indeterminate amount of time because they were standing in the street. Didn't matter what the reason was, and then they could be used as labor. So that's how the Reconstruction failed, and Jim Crow laws began to take over, because we got it right back where we wanted. That being very broad strokes, I don't know the specifics. Watch that documentary, 13. There's another one called Amend, The Fight for America, and it's about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is used to this day in federal cases defining what a citizen is. A lot of federal cases come up where they go right back to that 1868 amendment. And this series, it's a documentary series, talks about why. And it lays out the history from then until now. These are such deep and broad histories that you can hardly scratch the surface of them. But please look for those, because you will deepen your understanding of what is being dealt with today. I wanted to read you one little final piece here, written by Doris Kearns Goodwin. She writes wonderful history books. She wrote about Lincoln, she wrote about Johnson and others. Her husband was Richard Goodwin, who was the speechwriter for JFK and Lyndon Johnson. Knew those people well, and what a time that was to live during the civil rights movements. And so when he, in his last years of his life, he had hundreds of boxes of memos and documents and memorabilia from his years in the White House area, and all the years that he had been writing speeches. So they went through them together as he was ending his life, and she wrote this book commemorating. And there are people in here I know who lived through the 60s and 70s and know this history, lived it firsthand, but here's the background for it. But she wrote this in the conclusion to that book. And so I want to just share it with you because it's beautifully written. Many of the issues of the 1960s remain unresolved today. When LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he knew there would be massive upheaval and a great testing time to come. We are clearly in the midst of a profound testing time today, and at such times the study of history is crucial, providing perspective, warning, counsel, and even comfort. At this moment, when the guidance of history is most needed, history itself is under attack, its relevance in school curriculums questioned. When Abraham Lincoln was 28 years old, in 1837, he delivered a powerful argument for telling the stories of our revolutionary days as he addressed the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield. He was troubled by the mood of the country, a tendency to substitute passion for judgment, to engage in mob action in disregard of laws. In such an unsettled time, Lincoln cautioned, the dictator might arise. He worried that the passage of some 60 years since the American Revolution and ratification of the Constitution, the living history of that early time, of our founding time, the vivid and visceral experience once found in every family was fading along with the founding generation itself. To restore a state of communal feeling is so essential to democracy, he argues. The stories of the revolution and the founding of our nation must be told and retold, read and recounted. As time goes on, memories of the past fade, are forgotten or misunderstood. When that happens, the lessons about what opportunities were seized, what mistakes were made, and what chances were lost, what light might be cast on our own fractured time is lost as well. And David McCullough, another eminent historian, said that we don't need history to tell us what happened. We need history to tell us who we are. Don't lose your nerve, he says. Don't lose heart. Remember who you are and where you've come from, how you got to where you are, and that other people have been through worse, and you may go through it too. But you can keep your head and build for the future.
We can all say we learned quite a bit this evening. That was an incredible presentation. Thank you again to Humanities Montana for co-sponsoring this with us, and to Feisty Women's Week for helping getting the word out. Just a reminder that Feisty Women's Week continues on. Tomorrow we are hosting a self-defense class here at the library at noon to 2 o'clock with our very own black belt director, but it's not. Anyway, and then we are going to continue on Saturday at 1 p.m. over at the History Museum. They are doing a documentary showing of Feisty Women directed by our very own Shannon Newth, so please go check that out as well. It is also a free program. And then we're not done celebrating National Women's Day, which is also Saturday. On Tuesday, we are bringing our own Lee Larson, who is here in the crowd. She's going to be coming out and talking about the Fort Shaw basketball team, so join us for that and that incredible history lesson as well. Tuesday at, Lee, we said 6:30, right? 6:30. Glad one of us remembers. But we have lots going on here at the library. We have lots of resources for you to also dive into some of the history as well. So please feel free to use any of that we have. Thank you again for coming out this evening. Have a wonderful evening.